Okay, I've been given the green light to start the third and not necessarily the least important panel, how to ensure economic sovereignty without barring market access. This, as the title suggests, is very much linked to the field of political economy, but given today's situation, where we have, against the backdrop of the ongoing Sino-US economic tensions, as well as the knock-on effects of COVID-19 on the global supply chain and so on, you realize that this is not just a matter of political economy for just academics, it is a matter of concern for everyone. And I'm delighted today to helm a panel that features three very distinguished guests. Okay, I shall briefly introduce them in the order in which they will appear in the following session. Okay, first of all, my good colleague, Dr. Dipinder Singh Randhawa. He has spent time in the local universities after obtaining his PhD from the University of Syracuse in the United States. And I do know from his output here at RSIS that he monitors global trade and ASEAN economics very closely. So he's a wonderful person to have on the panel to talk about ASEAN's experience with economic sovereignty and resilience and so forth. Next up, we have Dr. Jonathan Hackenbroek, who is again coming to us with a very rich background in commenting on geopolitical as well as political economy aspects of current affairs in European media such as the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung and Le Monde. He's also a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. All right. Thirdly, we have a commentator, or rather a discussant, Dr. Elvira Fabri from the Delors Institute. I have also asked her, apart from serving as discussant, to say something about the French perspective on the notion of economic sovereignty and whether, you know, the temptation for governments during these trying times of COVID-19 economics is to actually resort to protectionist measures to jumpstart recovery and so on. Of course, you know, all the panelists, including the discussant, do not have to agree with me. I'm just the chair and the moderator, and I would expect quite robust exchange in the Q&A that follows. All right, without further ado, Dr. Dipinder, I invite you to take the floor, and I shall be very cruel with 10 minutes. All right, thank you.
Sorry, I just realized I was still muted. Thank you, Alan, for the kind words. I'm delighted to be here. And a very good morning and a good afternoon to colleagues spread out across the globe. Now, until a few years ago, the notion of strategic autonomy in the economic domain in open regions such as ASEAN that have achieved prosperity through trade and openness to foreign direct investment may have sounded like an oxymoron to some. However, two events since then, the trade dispute between the United States and China and the pandemic, have upended the multilateral trade system and brought to surface vulnerabilities in global production networks. And these are reflected in shortages of goods ranging from critical medical supplies, as we all know, to semiconductors, to even bicycles. And these developments have undermined national and regional economic security, placing concerns regarding supply chains at the front and center of public policy debates on the issue of strategic autonomy and resilience. So the ideas underlying the notion of strategic autonomy certainly are new. They may vary widely with the context, though. It's worth bearing in mind that since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, countries have pursued variants of industrial policies to meet national objectives. Be it the 21st century version of Friedrich List's infant industry argument or vanilla tax and subsidy schemes. Others have deployed investments in public investments in R&D or in new technologies, or directly intervene to steer the private sector in a particular direction. I would like to focus on two themes. First, how can ASEAN pursue the quest for resilience? And secondly, the untapped and mutually beneficial potential for deepening collaboration between ASEAN and the EU. The question here, of course, is how does the quest for resilience translate into practical advice for ASEAN, a region that's found prosperity through an economic ecosystem open to trade and investment. Now, resilience broadly refers to developing capacity to regenerate critical sectors quickly after a shock. But this can be finessed a great deal further depending on the context. In the narrow sense, of course, it alludes to recovering supply chains either by developing local capacity or securing external supply lines. In the context of the pandemic, it also alludes to food security, to strengthening public health systems, to minimizing learning disruptions at the primary school education level, and to providing a safety net to the most vulnerable. In effect, to building back better and not repeating the mistakes of the past. So over the years, as challenges emerge, ASEAN has developed mechanisms to deal with the challenges, be they external, through the ASEAN's defense ministers' meetings and ADM+, and internally through agreements including the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, which encompasses human security, inclusiveness, and sustainability. Now, while the pandemic and the trade disputes served as a wake-up call of the vulnerabilities as well as the substantial possibilities that lie ahead, I will contend that ASEAN is at a juncture where it should not, and indeed need not, align with either superpower, but deploy its own growing strengths to attract investment and boost trade with all regions. It's one of the fastest growing regions of the world over the past 5 decades. It has a large growing market, a skilled labor force, a manufacturing sector that's steadily moving up the value-added chain, and a favorable demographic profile. Now, while capabilities obviously differ vastly across ASEAN, what's less obvious is the region has inexorably grown in significance in trade and FDI for all major regions. With 650 million people, a combined GDP of $3 trillion US, which is expected to double by 2040, is projected to be the 4th largest single market by 2030 after the United States, the EU, and China. Analysts often tend to overlook the significance of ASEAN. US investments in ASEAN, for instance, exceed its cumulative investments in China, India, Japan, and South Korea combined. China and ASEAN are each other's largest trading partners. The European Union's trade and investment in ASEAN have grown impressively in recent years, but there remains substantial untapped potential. And all of this while intra-ASEAN liberalization is at a formative stage, and that's indicative of the untapped capacity and potential for growth. ASEAN has demonstrated capacity to respond to crises in the past and come together in mutual interest. For instance, after the Asian financial crisis of 1997, ASEAN states developed mechanisms through the Chiang Mai Initiative to build defenses against speculative attacks by establishing currency swaps, and also developed local currency bond markets to diversify funding sources and reduce currency risk. And this indeed served ASEAN very well during the global financial crisis. However, the unsettled environment today has reinforced a sense of urgency within ASEAN. Intra-ASEAN collaboration is guided by the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint of 2015, with ongoing efforts that include operationalizing the ASEAN Single Window, a trade facilitation initiative, work on digitization of the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement with its great deal of scope, and ASEAN-wide certification, which should boost and make it easier to export. These initiatives in the final stages, but they're not enough for the time. If you look ahead, ASEAN will soon confront the twin challenges arising from the onset of technologies of the 4th industrial revolution and the risks from climate change, and of course, the deep concerns arising from surging inequality. Individual ASEAN states are constrained in responding because of the limitations of capacity, capabilities, and resources. Collectively, however, to start with, the ASEAN 6, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, acting in concert, have the potential to yield substantial network effects. How ASEAN deals with the current and imminent challenges will shape the region's growth prospects in the years ahead. On both climate change and with new technologies, country initiatives are already leading to a convergence and complementarity of policy responses. As an illustration, to combat the effects of climate change, this would call for pooling of resources and assigning specific mandates to member states, and I'm happy to address these issues in detail during the discussions. Now, as the two most dynamic and forward-looking regions seeking to strengthen the rules-based multilateral system and seeking autonomy and agency on economic and security issues, the potential for ASEAN-EU collaboration is a mutual self-interest and of great benefit. In the absence of multilateral progress on trade liberalization, ASEAN is seeking to diversify trade through plurilateral agreements based on WTO principles. And herein lies a great deal of promise in stepping up EU-ASEAN FTA talks. For instance, trade collaboration and bolstering WTO compliant multilateral negotiations, including e-commerce, the services sector, and in the digital domain. In collaboration, climate mitigation measures, including reducing carbon emissions, protecting the critically important tropical rainforests, flood control, protection of coastal areas and island economies, amongst others. Digital development and drawing upon 21st century technology to solve problems that have persisted for decades. And this includes policy effectiveness, sharpening up the state's ability to respond and measure their initiatives, financial inclusion. There's a great deal that can be drawn upon from experience and expertise in the EU and perhaps even the OECD. I am, needless to say, mindful of the challenges that are arising from enduring problems in the South China Sea, the lingering Rohingya refugee issue, and the brutal after effects of the coup in Myanmar. In conclusion, notwithstanding the prevailing geopolitical environment fraught with endemic uncertainties, the potential remains vast. It will, however, call for considerably greater coordination than ASEAN's achieved in the past, with the ASEAN 6 perhaps driving change. And this could indeed provide a template for the region's growth and prosperity in the decades ahead. Furthermore, meaningful collaboration with the EU will, I think, send a strong signals and perhaps even offer a beacon of light to the global community, saying that important players still adhere to a rules-based multilateralism that's both individually and universally beneficial. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dipinder. I think there was a lot of food for thought and a very nice introduction into how ASEAN tends to understand or appreciate notion of strategic autonomy in economic terms. All right, let me now call upon Dr. Jonathan Hackenbroich to take the floor. All yours.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and hello from Germany and Europe. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. I think Dipinder already talked quite a bit about the trends and the politicization and geopoliticization of trade that we're facing, and how that creates situations that many of us, and certainly in Europeans and I believe people in the ASEAN region as well, would like to avoid, and where this is something when we talk about economic coercion and trade being used for the achievement of geopolitical goals, a situation that's new to us in a certain way. It's not entirely new, it's always happened, but how it has increased, and a situation that where this notion of strategic autonomy comes in, and where we wonder how does that how do we react, and that's precisely the topic that we at ECFR, at the European Council on Foreign Relations, have been looking at for the last 2 years as part of a task force that we brought together with participants, high-level participants from the French and German governments, French and German private sectors, as well as MPs. And we looked at very concrete policy options. What does in the context of open strategic autonomy, which is of course the slogan of the EU on trade policy and even wider and beyond that, and the question we kept asking is very concretely, what do you do in a situation when you face the weaponization of trade, economic coercion, or it could be trade, but or trade in a larger sense, sanctions as well, the use of legal tools like export controls, thinking of China's new export control law, for instance, and other situations, what I would call squeezing laws, where companies, European companies or other companies on a third market, like the Chinese market or the Russian market, the US market, it's not about any one country, face a situation where where they face punishment if they don't comply with, if they do comply with their European legislation or US legislation or other legislations, and where companies are sort of caught in the middle of this geopolitical struggle. And beyond the trends that we sort of identified, as I said, we looked at very concrete options for the EU, but I think the discussion is a larger one, and will certainly be helpful or fruitful to discuss with others. And I think the number one option or the number one thing coming out of these discussions, and certainly for us at ECFR, is that is exactly what Dipinder mentioned as well, is linking up closely with partners, with like-minded countries around the world who are interested in preserving the rules-based order and rules-based trade, and focusing on a positive agenda of tying close links with these countries, and underscoring that this is the way Europeans and others would like to trade and enter into economic relations with each other. But we also looked at and the second pillar of that is also something that Dipinder mentioned with regard to ASEAN, is economic strength and your own innovativeness, and making sure that you're a strong economy is of course a base in responding to economic coercion and the geopoliticization of trade and economic links. But we also identified a vulnerability, a fourfold vulnerability, and I'll talk about this vulnerability very quickly, and then three options in particular that we've analyzed for Europe. And the vulnerability we find is that as things stand, the EU, but I would argue others as well, are vulnerable when trade is used as a weapon. So not in trade measures, defensive measures are not used for trade, for reasons of unfair trade practices, but actually to influence politics when they're used swiftly, because oftentimes we can't act very swiftly. And in fact, a WTO decision oftentimes takes a very long time. And when trade is used politically, then we may not have this time, because a political decision has to go ahead within weeks or months at the most, oftentimes. But in the meantime, you can use economically restrictive measures like the Chinese import curbs on Australia, and influence politics and policies. Gray zone tools, oftentimes we see as a third area or dimension of this vulnerability. Oftentimes it's not even that clear whether a certain measure, take the anti-dumping measures against Australia, are for sure illegal under the WTO. But the way they are used and the time when they are used and the damage that they create at that time when they're tied to a different policy make them, from our point of view, illegal under international law. But they may not always be. It may not always be that clear under WTO law. And ideally, from a coercer's point of view, from a third country point of view, economic coercion will divide the EU or also ASEAN countries rather than unite them against whatever the coercion policy is. And those are the 4 dimensions that we try to address in thinking about tools. And now I'll come to the tools. One is institutional. The second one is a defensive tool. And the third one is a legal tool. The first one, institutional, that we thought about as an option for Europe. And this is something we authored as ECFR, of course, not in the name of the governments or companies involved in our process, is a resilience office for the EU, where you have at a high strategic level an office created that is responsible for analysis, tying together all the different, having a strategic look at all the different instruments that the EU uses to analyze, but also respond to economic coercion and the geopoliticization of trade. Having an analytical strategic view on what's going on to understand pressure instances. Oftentimes we don't hear about them, or the EU doesn't hear about them because they happen below the radar, or in one member state that we don't know in another member state, and so forth. So a strategic unit at a high level, in the EU's case, in the European Commission. And this resilience office could also be an interlocutor with third country agencies that, for example, are responsible for export controls or sanctions or so. And the second tool is a defensive tool that the Commission is now working on and will propose by beginning of December. It's called an anti-coercion instrument and would allow the EU to leverage countermeasures, not against unfair trade practices, because for that we have there are trade defense instruments, of course, but against grave instances of economic coercion where they violate a norm in international law, the sovereignty of member states, and these are grave instances. But the idea here is to have an economic deterrent in place to preserve your capacity to act under pressure. We could think punitive tariffs, sanctions, also possibly, though this would have to be investigated in detail, what Russia's use of energy links to affect certain policies and so forth. And the third tool I'll just talk about, and then I'll stop, is a legal tool, and it's the sort of good old blocking statute that when you now talk to Europeans and many others about, then we tend to think of US financial sanctions only, but it also, and of a highly dysfunctional tool. But ultimately, this is a situation about these squeezing laws where European companies or ASEAN companies might be required to behave in ways that are detrimental to interests, their own interests, but not just their own interests, but sovereignty related interests or strategic autonomy related interests the EU or ASEAN countries might have, and where they're in a squeeze situation where they themselves are just put between a rock and a hard place. And for that, a blocking statute that's very different than the current one, and that can be applied to certain legal norms in China as well, where companies are required to divert trade flows, at least theoretically, could be required to do so in a certain way, to block them in principle, at least, from doing so, but then to put it on, then to link it to this defensive tool and to make it a question between the EU and the third country, rather than putting companies in between a rock and a hard place. So this could be the legal basis for the defensive tool and countermeasures between states, or rather between the European Union and third countries. I'll stop here. These are ideas for the debate that we've discussed in detail and analyzed in detail, but would be very, very interested in hearing thoughts on these, also from an ASEAN perspective. And I've tried to make it very concrete. There's a lot to say on the strategic dimensions and the different examples of economic coercion, but these are three tools that we've discussed and thought about, and that are partly now being revised or proposed on the European level. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. I was in fact taking notes very enthusiastically, and I note that amongst your three tools, in fact, I should say all three tools are in a sense a demonstration of the possibility of using economic regionalism as the foundation for some kind of rules-based mechanism to protect each constituent member state or member economy within a particular regional club, and so on. Okay, I expect more questions on this front during the Q&A. Okay, over now to you, Dr. Elvira Fabri.
Thank you very much. It's my turn to thank you for the invitation to add some small comments on the excellent analysis that have just been presented by the two previous speakers. I want to underline that this is a very timely discussion and very meaningful one between ASEAN and the EU, because when we're addressing the issue about economic sovereignty, we directly understand that it's more at a regional level that we have the capacity to build up some strategy to foster on the capacity to mutualize the capabilities of the different member states, and precisely at the level of the EU single markets and the level of the Asian markets, it is particularly interesting. And I think we have some several commonalities that should be underlined. Well, first of all, in 2020, ASEAN became the first trade partner of China at the same moment when China became the first trade partner of the EU. And we share the same increasing asymmetry in our trade relation with such a partner like China, with increasing dependency to Chinese imports. We also have some asymmetries in between our member states in the dependencies to the Chinese markets, a major actor, of course, at the level of the global economy. And an additional element is also a willingness not to be only on the position to respond to initiatives coming from major actors like the United States and China, and not to be in a position to be aligned on the respective strategies, and the same willingness to diversify and to our partnerships throughout the world. So I think it's particularly interesting to have this discussion. Now moving on to the European strategy, I think it was just underlined by Jonathan that the EU is taking some strong initiative at the moment. All countries throughout the world have been exposed to the disruption of supply chains, and now trying to adapt from the just-in-time strategy to the just-in-case strategy, building up on different initiatives, ranging from increasing stocks, from increasing domestic capabilities, to diversifying supply chains. And that raises the questions about the role of public support in those initiatives that have to be taken by public companies, and to what point public support can help increase the resilience of supply chains. To what point should we politicize supply chains? And this is the title of this discussion: how to increase economic sovereignty while keeping markets open. I think that on the European side, this first of all has a role in speeding up the agenda of level playing field that was previously engaged before the COVID crisis and before the major disruption that we have faced. And the European strategy is now really built up on two main pillars, which is the capacity to build up, to equip itself with some autonomous tools, allowing to defend the interests of European firms within the single market, and to address the trade distortions that we haven't been able at the moment to tackle at the multilateral level. Because I think that between Asian countries and European countries, we have the same eagerness to increase the regulation at the multilateral level. It was previously very well underlined by Dr. Dipinder Singh Radhavan. We share the same willingness to engage in WTO reform and to be able to bring the United States and China to the table of the negotiation, not only to open new negotiation in new sectors like e-commerce and others, but also to be able to rely on more multilateral rules for the regulation of the global economy. This is a major issue, but while doing so, the European Union is really developing on parallel a capacity to have autonomous tools to address those trade distortions, which are increasing our dependencies and critical dependencies in supply chains. That's why Jonathan has insisted on this tool allowing to build up a capacity of anti-coercion, and has very well explained the main avenues, the main proposals that are on the table. But the agenda of the EU on those autonomous tools, it's a quite large one. It has started in 2020 in implementing an FDI screening mechanism, and now member states are equipping themselves with such mechanisms on the basis of common guidelines to be able to have more capacity of scrutiny and to be able to prevent some takeovers that which could create some breaches into supply chains and industrial capacities within the single market. Another tool, a second tool, which is now very high in the agenda, is the capacity to control the role of foreign subsidies, which benefit to companies importing or acting within the single market. This tool is already on the table of the negotiation between the member states. There's a proposal from the European Commission, which will be discussed between the European Commission, European Parliament, and the Council during next spring, and as well as a tool introducing more reciprocity in the opening of public procurement, allowing to negotiate with the trade partners the opening of the public procurement. All those different tools are currently discussed between member states to be able to reduce those trade distortions and at the same time to preserve the attractiveness of the single market. They are not conceived as protectionist measures. They are conceived, they are thought and they are discussed as being able precisely to guarantee the openness of the European markets and to prepare some further discussion, be it at a bilateral level or the multilateral level. And that's where I think it's interesting to see how France is positioning itself in those discussions. But I will come back to that in a minute. The second pillar of the European strategy is industrial policy. And I think we have to keep in mind that the European strategic autonomy, which is discussed, is precisely called open strategic autonomy. It is intended to be able to preserve open markets and not to tend towards a more protectionist approach of trade. Trade is a major pillar in the strategy, but there are other instruments, which is the first of all the industrial strategy that Europeans are implementing. The second pillar of the European strategy is really industrial policy, taking advantage of the recovery fund that has been agreed between member states, which is really an historical step from the point of view of the European integration, providing member states with more capability to leverage private and public funds to invest in the industrial capacity, and allowing the launch notably of alliances in strategic sectors to mutualize the capabilities of member states, for example, in semiconductors, as well as hydrogens. And those are major initiatives that are already now in the pipe. Coming to the French position in this strategy, I think that we have to keep in mind that France has had a leading role in pressing this agenda at the European level. France, what with Germany, the two main actors who were advocating for the FDI screening mechanism, and is really pressing strong on issues like anti-coercion, as well as the public procurement instrument. And one additional instrument that I didn't mention is, of course, the carbon adjustment border mechanism, which will be also high in the agenda of the French presidency of the Council of the European Union, which will start in next January. At the level of the French government, the focus is today really to protect without protectionism, and to allow precisely to preserve the opening of markets. We have to keep in mind that when President Emmanuel Macron was campaigning in 2017, he was the main defender of market opening, and the Minister for the Economy, Bruno Le Maire, has been advocating recently really to increase the capability of France to trade with the more diverse countries in the world. A major part of the recovery fund is now dedicated in France in the increase of industrial capabilities. More than 30 billions are focused currently in transforming existing sectors like automotive, aerospace, but also in investing in some new sectors like green hydrogen, artificial intelligence, biotech, and in more risky sectors like quantum computing, for example. And so the French strategy at the moment is really sort of building up on a parallel as the European strategy, as much on defensive tools as on building up domestic capabilities. And I think that the willingness to diversify partners in trade policy is really fitting with the eagerness of the ASEAN countries to increase trustful trade relations, and comes really at a timely moment. At the European level, we already have some FTAs signed with several members of ASEANs and ongoing negotiations. and speeding those negotiations during the next year will be as well high on the European agenda, as much on the bilateral basis with member states of the ASEAN as on the more regional level between ASEAN and the EU. And I will stop there for the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Elvira. I think that is a lot of food for thought. And it also, I think, reveals to those of us who monitor ASEAN that we have a lot to learn actually from improving on regional coordination within ASEAN or within the Indo-Pacific on managing trade policy to advance the prosperity of each national economy and so on. All right. I would, in view of the fact that I've got only 2 questions at the moment from apparently the same person, invite perhaps both speakers, all right, Dipinder and Jonathan, to respond to Dr. Elvira Fabri's comments first before we open it up to the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Alan. At the very outset, I must say I've found both Jonathan and Elvira's talks riveting. It opened up my eyes, thoughts to something that we've been prone to sweeping under the rug in some sense. And that is the prospect of weaponization of trade, as Jonathan pointed out. And given the very nature of the concord within ASEAN, we're not in a very strong position to combat anything. I mean, you can see very easily how members can be pried away. And just to take one context, one simple example, in the case of central bank digital currencies, for instance, in many quarters, there are deep concerns about how some of the large players in global economies can literally supplant domestic currencies, and this is easy in a region where currencies are very soft. Beyond that, I mean, there's a huge amount of bilateral assistance within smaller members of ASEAN, which also opens up areas of vulnerability. But having said that, to take a more positive stance, I mean, listening to both the speakers, in fact, if anything, it further reinforced for me the urgency, the need, and the value in greater collaboration, both on learning on policy issues, as you pointed out, and more tangible agreements on liberalization of trade, both in goods and in services, and particular rule-based system and order. Because I mean, at the psychological level, even for nation states, when you see a very successful example, I mean, there are incentives to emulate. And lest we get too drawn up in a very bleak scenario, I think one just has to look back at the last time there were tariff wars, the Taft-Spooly Act, and what devastation the beggar thy neighbor policies in the 20s and 30s reached. I don't think anybody, even the most extreme elements in the United States or China, would ever want a reversion to that. So in that sense, the lessons of history and what we see around, I think, do offer some hope. And I'm speaking, of course, at a very macro level here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dipinder. Jonathan, would you like to respond?
I can very briefly, but I think I agree with both my speakers, my fellow speakers, and it's yeah, obviously a real pleasure to hear them on these issues. I think yeah, what Dipinder just said is very interesting. I think indeed more tangible agreements and building the network of agreements between like-minded states and those who value rules-based trade is very important. And I can see clearly an opening there, at least in theory, and in practice we shall see. But that's quite something already. So I mean, I think there's, as everyone knows, quite a bit of fatigue or backlog on ratifying trade agreements, and the EU is still struggling to ratify the CETA with Canada. But I think that renewed focus on important on building the trade networks with like-minded countries and creating rules-based spaces, at least as much as possible, I think is certainly part of what's important for strategic autonomy as well. I'll leave it there. Probably, of course, Elvira was right to outline all of these different instruments and things that the EU is currently thinking about, and that's probably very interesting as well to look at those.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. All right, that's actually a very nice point upon which to segue into the large question posed by this anonymous attendee. He asks if within the context of this very specific theory logic called Hirschman theory of economic interdependence, amidst this backdrop of rising nationalism and protectionism during the pandemic, how will economic statecraft, and I assume that he or she means national economic statecraft, influence strategic autonomy? And of course, there is a second question there, which I suppose can be answered separately. Is the WTO a relevant supranational organization to intervene and enforce the international rules-based order? Any takers? Elvira, you can also respond if you want to.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. Oh, please go ahead, Elvira.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I'm just going to point out on the WTO. I mean, that's an end point. It provides a very useful framework and a set of rules by which to avoid, and those are by no means dead and buried. And that was I think that's what part of the rationale of having this workshop amongst like-minded. Neither region wants to be caught in the crossfires. ASEAN's in even a more vulnerable position, given the widely divergent economic systems and the heterogeneous levels of development to these. So, I mean, our prosperity and everything has, again, to reiterate the obvious, been deeply contingent on our rules-based multilateral order. I'm sorry, I'm parroting the same thing again and again, but I don't think that can be overemphasized. And as I mentioned, the WTO merely, the existing framework is not so much the institution, but the rules of the game, which have benefited everybody vastly. There are asymmetries, but that is and continues to remain the best hope.
Okay, all right, thank you. Elvira, over to you.
Well, I think that the person who raised the question is very right to raise the issue about pressure coming from civil society about more identity economics and the pressure for more nationalism, which is coming also at the crossroad of all the efforts that we engage in to reduce the carbon footprint of our production systems, and which are increasing the issues about developing more circular economy, which would stand to benefit to more the domestic production. At the same time, I think it's interesting precisely that this debate is evolving, maturing, and needs to be based on more specific knowledge of our dependencies. And once we get to the level of those dependencies more precisely, sector by sector, product by product, the issue becomes much more complex because it raises the question of domestic capabilities, of the knowledge that we would have to develop more capabilities at the domestic level, but also acceptance from the public opinion to develop those capabilities. If I can raise an issue, an example, which is quite illustrative, the issue concerning our dependencies to rare earth and strategic minerals. For example, at the EU level, we see that we are dependent to the level of the 98% of imports of rare earth coming from China. And this is obviously a very critical issue for the development of digital technologies and green technologies for the climate change mitigation. How we will increase our domestic capabilities and being able to diversify our supply is a major challenge for the coming years. And this is not a question about onshoring again the capability of production and transformation, extraction and transformation that we have abandoned to China in the years in the 1990s, and it's when we get at the level of this more complex arbitrage of the public decisions that the debate about a more nationalistic approach of production is really meaningful.
Okay, that's very interesting. Now let's go to a question from Mr. Govan Lebras, Deputy Director of CAPS. This is specifically to Dipinder. You mentioned the issues of resource protection in coastal areas. Is there a path for further cooperation and capacity building in this regard between the EU and ASEAN countries? How can we ensure sustainability and carbon compatibility of our trade relations and agreements in order to overcome the fatigue Jonathan is speaking about? All right, Dipinder, all yours.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent question and a very pertinent one. There are already examples. Singapore, for example, has been consulting with the Dutch, who probably have the best expertise in the world on flood control and the effects of rising water levels. And this has been, like I said, late 90s. That's been going on. Recently, over the last couple of years on carbon trading. So let me just step back for a moment. The tropical rainforests are one of the largest resources for soaking up carbon from the environment. And we in Singapore and elsewhere also knows what deforestation does. But if you've noticed, we haven't had the haze for a couple of years. Hopefully it stays that way. So with carbon trading, there are incentives to buy up permits as an investment. And as the economists put it, which company would not like to claim they've saved an orangutan in Sumatran jungles and brought very visual benefits? So what we are seeing actually is a regeneration. And after the Amazon and the Congo Basin, as economists put it, this is the third largest area. So there is a great deal, everything from carbon trading to flood protection, which is, again, we saw that, that was because of unseasonal rains in Germany and in France and other parts of Europe, the devastation and the utterly unpredictable nature of what it can wreak. So there is a great deal of latent expertise within the EU on that. And I think there's a great deal of potential for collaboration. And these are live bread and butter issues which affect. We are in a region which is extremely vulnerable to extreme heat and humidity, as anybody living here knows very well, amongst the most vulnerable. So I'm not sure the question of fatigue, even amongst policymakers in this particular domain, at least on environmental protection and sustainability, is a constraint to effective intermediation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dipinder, for actually trailing lots of interesting crumbs of questions that we could go on for another half an hour about. In fact, I would have personally like to hear from the panelists about how Europe and ASEAN looks at this thing called the carbon border adjustment mechanism, something that has become very trendy of late. Of course, we're going to COP26 and so on. All right, I'm told by the organizers that I have to wrap this up because you know, we have to give space for the closing remarks and so on. I'm unable, of course, to get to the last two questions in the Q&A channel. Whoever it is who still would like to pursue those questions, please write to some of us at RSIS events and we'll follow up with the necessary emails. Or you can contact Jonathan and Elvira through a simple Google search on the internet, and you can contact them directly for responses. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll hand the space over to Amalina.
Thank you, panelists. We now invite Mr. Gurban Lubrak, Deputy Director of the Center for Analysis, Planning and Strategy at the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France, to deliver his closing remarks. Mr. Lubrak, please.
Thank you very much, Amalina. It's really a pleasure and a challenge, of course, to enter into conclusive remarks of a very rich, dense, stimulating sessions that we had, and I'm very thankful to each and every of the panelists for a very thought-provoking intervention and smooth handling and very fluid discussion. So many thanks for that. I'd like maybe to highlight three ideas. The first is that I am struck by the fact that there are between us, since the idea was to share our visions and to discuss on what makes us close and what makes us differ on some issues, on how we converge on the vision, the challenges and the diagnoses, on asymmetries, because there are several, on our assessment on some of the threats, cyber, on the threats to the rule-based order and the necessity to come over it, on the fact that in a number of transversal issues, and especially cyber, we can't afford to any disruption. We need resilience. We need a bit more than resilience. We need the ability to prevent shocks, which is different, and that is something that is a strong call for action and for protection, and the ability to actually converge on what is needed to face the threats. We converge on the fact that whether you call it defense of democracy or defense of rule-based order, there is a threat in that respect as well. There are attempts to disrupt these processes and to take advantage of their weakness. There is a weaponization of interdependencies, and the appropriate way to deal with that is not to close borders and to isolate, but rather to develop what we have in common, an eagerness to increase regulation in multilateral forum, to bring the great powers that are competing into cooperation, into some sort of negotiation over the rules of the game, over the level playing fields. We need to develop also capacities to be able to be rule makers against trade distortion in the domain of cyber behaviors, in the domain, of course, of our capacity to better understand and assess and regulate the maritime domain, for example. So my second point is to say that when it comes to the discussion on what are the tools of action that we can have to go ahead in this respect, we and whether, of course, with at the center of our session the question of European strategic autonomy, we have the same diplomatic and strategic discussion over that. We are wondering how we can face this challenge and how we can be collectively relevant and how we can play a role. We see that our national capacities for each and every state are not sufficient to deal with these challenges in an appropriate manner. I mean, for the most part of them, of course, not all of them. Of course, nations have a meaning and states have a meaning, but you have networks effects and you have to use complementarities. So you have to act collectively. I also pick up a notion that pretty much echo what we had for the past decades in European debates, the idea that ASEAN is indispensable to set principles, to express collective views, build regional credibility at a global level, whereas it's not necessarily the appropriate level to make very specific bilateral cooperation. So then you need to have both. And this is something that is important in the way the Asian countries are working with the Europeans, and vice versa. What is the appropriate level to deal with the situation? Do you need to go with ad hoc and pick up the appropriate partner to move ahead where there are capacities, where there are interests, or do you need to have a collective discussion between the blocks? There is also a strong convergence on and that's part of a diplomatic discussion. It's not just an assessment; it's also the beginning of a diplomatic response when we speak about the risk that and the threats that are posed by some critical dependencies that you need to tackle the appropriate way, not creating protectionism, not venturing and bowing to some sort that we have, and we spoke at the very end of our panel with Elvire of the difficulties for the Europeans to come over some sort of a fatigue for international trade agreements. This is really an issue on which we need to bring very different discussions on our side too, because you cannot. I mean, it's one thing to pretend and to wish that you are up to a strategic discussion over the role you have in the world and how you seize it. But that's another story to really develop the tools that make you actually a global player. One thing I would like also to highlight, and I'm picking up there in Deepinder and in Ambassador Speno's intervention in the beginning, is diversification of trade relations, of islands, of platforms. We want to be able to have choices, not to be pushed into binary choices. We want to have alternatives. We want to avoid being over dependent. That was also very clear in our presentation on Asian Digital Master Plan on the one hand, and its approach of the different options of autonomy in the cyber. And that's exactly, by the way, the purpose of the European strategy on Indo-Pacific to be just like Yvonne has said, quoting HRVP Borrell, a proposition, an invitation, a way to be able to offer alternatives, whether it be in the economic domain, in capacity building, in dealing with the global threats, like Deepinder recalled. There are plenty of opportunities to cooperate on the coastal areas, on dealing with also the decarbonation of our economies and so on. It's offering opportunities to do so, and having a very different, convergent but different perspective, philosophy, and offer to make to the countries of the Indo-Pacific than what is existing on the other on another note with what the US are doing, and that's maybe I would probably indulge into a more French or personal notes there, saying that that's one of the reasons why AUKUS was a shock, because in fact what it was about with building those very close partnership that we have in the Indo-Pacific is precisely to be able to support a strategy which is offering alternatives with exactly the same strategic goal than what the US and the whole of us are trying to do in the Indo-Pacific. And this is something that you don't do just by picking up strong allies, military speaking. It's something you do in taking into account the diversity of the partners in the region, what they need, what they want, and what you can offer to them. So fortunately, I think this is it is going to be an ongoing conversation. I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of things. I know that because it was really a rich conversation. But I'm simply very, very happy that we had this session in which we've been able to provide a range of speakers of different origins and getting together and bringing perspectives that are terrifically complementary, and I think also bringing a lot and with a lot of added value to each other. At least that's what I got, and so thank you to RSIS, and thank you to the organizers and to our speakers. Really looking forward to move on this conversation forward in the number of issues that we had today. So Amalina, I guess it's over to you now. So have a great night or day, depending on where you are, and looking forward. Thank you very much.
Let me conclude as well, and what I will do in a very, very short period of time, a minute or so. First and foremost, I agree with everything that Monsieur Lebras has said. I think there is so much areas of convergence and room for additional research and cooperation. But what I would like to do in a very short time is to actually thank all the people who made this event possible. So a big thanks to the 4 ambassadors who agreed to participate to this event. Thank you, of course, to all the speakers, discussants, chairs, as well as all the participants who actively asked questions and remained committed to the full 3 hours of this particular event. Beyond that, at RSIS, there are some people I would like to personally thank for their hard work. Anthony, Farik, Scott, Adrian, Amalina for being a fantastic MC. And big thanks, of course, also to our partners at CAPS. And a very final thought for the staff of the French embassy, both, of course, the Ambassador Abansour, but also Monsieur Sylvain Nolin. It was a pleasure working with you in the last few months to make this event today possible. So a big thank you to all of you. And I believe this is yet again a successful example of RSIS collaborating with a European-based institution, and we look forward to many more dialogues in the months and the years to come. Thank you very much, and enjoy your evening or the rest of your day if you're based in Paris. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Emmers. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the RSIS-CAPS workshop. On behalf of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies and the Center for Analysis, Planning and Strategy at the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France, thank you for joining us and have a good day ahead.